Assalamu alaikum, book lovers, and welcome to today's edition of Book Bytes on the Ramadan show. I have the absolute pleasure of interviewing local author Shubnum Khan today about her latest novel, The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil. This needs little introduction because I think it's been quite a media event since its launch a few weeks ago, and we've been hearing a lot about it in the media. Shabnam has been presenting at various launches and festivals around South Africa so far, and on the online spaces as well. Shubnum Khan is an author and artist based in Durban. Her acclaimed debut novel, Onion Tears, was shortlisted for the Penguin Prize for African Writing and the University of Johannesburg Debut Fiction Prize. Her quirky essay collection, How I Accidentally Became a Global Stockphoto, was published in South Africa and India in 2021. And we have the pleasure of chatting to her today about The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil that is being launched both locally and globally. I think it's a huge celebration to see a local author being celebrated on the global stage in this way. Assalamu alaikum, Shabnam. Welcome to Book Bites this afternoon.
Walaikum salam. Thanks so much for having me, Shafinaaz, and thank you for that nice introduction.
I think it really is a celebration because we know how hard it is to, create and carve a niche for yourself in the writing space, to find your voice and to see your work being sort of put out there, celebrated in quite this way. So tell us the feeling, of having this new book out. You've put a lot of years into it. Speak to us about your process and the feeling of getting The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil out there.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's exciting. It's nice to have the book out there, not only locally but internationally, which is new for me. I mean, it's a good feeling, and it's also the kind of story I would have wanted to be. This is the kind of book I would have wanted to be out, like sort of as like my international debut, because it's a story about Durban, and it's a story about love, and it encompasses all the things that have been interesting me over the last few years. So yeah, it's been good, alhamdulillah, and it's been exciting. But I'm also just a cautiously optimistic person, so we'll see how it goes.
I think it's interesting. I mean, now, if we before we get into the sort of flesh of the book, to look back at your journey, right? It's been such an interesting journey. We know and we loved Onion Tears. It was a story about women. It was a story about different generations of women, and it was your debut. It was well received, and from what I hear, you have a reprint. So we know that people are reading Lost Love. They can also go back and get copies of Onion Tears. Tell us about where it began, how it began for you, and what it's been like over the last decade or so.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. That's an interesting question, Shafinaz. I think I always wanted to write, but I could never finish what I was writing. And so when I was doing a degree in media and English at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I did a third year creative writing course. And it basically took me into my master's in English, which was a master's in creative writing. And I basically, my thesis was that I had to work on a novel. And for me, I mean, I don't know if it's so far back now. I can't imagine that I didn't think it was going to get published, but for me, it was my thesis, so I didn't have the idea that it's going to get published by a publisher in South Africa while I was doing it. For me, I was just like, I need to get this dissertation finished. And I mean, it was published pretty soon after I finished it. And then I took a long break from writing for a while because I think, I don't know, the joy of writing left me, and I was filled with a lot of fear, and I lost a lot of my confidence, and it took me a long time to get back into writing. But I was working slowly on this novel, like bit by bit, piece by piece, slowly over the years, trying to make it into a real actual book. And at the same time, I was getting my own confidence and voice back. And I think I used to always think that my next novel would come out so soon after Onion Tears, but it's more than 10 years now. And I really do believe like a book happens when it's supposed to happen and when it's supposed to come out. And this was the perfect time. There was not another time for this. So there was a big gap between the two novels.
Okay, but so in between, you had this sort of great or not so great, I don't know, experience of having this global stock photo. I know you've spoken on various platforms, but for my audience, just give us a sense of how did the anthology come about, how it became, the accidental global stock photo story. And eventually you've got this collection out of it. Tell us about your experience and the influence of these stories.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. So that it's like a travel memoir, came out about 2 years ago in 2021 or 3 years ago. And that was a very unexpected book. And it wasn't that hard in a sense for me to write because it had been experiences of me traveling and having these strange and funny experiences in my life. And it really came up because I used to tweet about the stories that I was experiencing. So whenever I had like a very strange experience, I would tweet about it. Also because I live at home, I live in Durban. I don't socialize too much. Like I'm a very home person. And so the only place where I shared quite a bit was on Twitter. Like that social media was like where I thought I like found my friends, So I would share my stories as if I was just talking to all my friends. Um, and so I kept sharing all these strange stories, including one of them, which is how I became a global stock photo, which is basically I lost the right to a photo I took in university where I thought the photographer was using it for his portfolio. There was like about 100 of us who went to that shoot that day, and we got a professional photograph in exchange. And I mean, in retrospect, I was very foolish. I just wanted a good photo, as you do when you're in your early 20s. And this was like when Instagram and stuff was just still coming out, and like you were striving for the perfect photo. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna get a great photo. Did not get a great photo, FYI. But basically, I didn't realize until like 2 years later when someone saw me in a newspaper in Canada, and they said, why are you in an advert for immigration? And I realized when I looked at that photo that I had given away the rights to this photo. And when I contacted the photographer, he was like, yeah, you signed away rights to this photo. I can sell them wherever I want. And I mean, I basically told the story in a really funny way because I felt like you had to look at the situation with humor because otherwise I would just be sitting and crying about like my face in all these McDonald adverts and teeth whitening adverts and all these crazy things. And yeah, basically I wrote a book with including that story. And because I had been sharing so much of these strange stories, Andrea Natras at Pan Macmillan approached me and said, don't you want to put this in a collection of in a book, in an anthology? Like we can put all these stories and put it together and make it into a book. And so that's how the book came about. It was basically just like putting it on social media and then a publisher coming and approaching me and saying, let's make it into a book. Like I think it'll do good. So yeah, that's how that happened.
So a definitely positive spin, otherwise on an otherwise disempowering experience.
Yeah.
Glad to see that that worked out well. But I mean, just to veer off the path for a second and say, like, in an age of social media, a lot of young people watching this, I mean, we're all putting selfies out there, and when we were at a restaurant and just out with friends, how much are we actually giving away of our content, so to speak, especially personal content when we put it out there? Do you have a comment on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think my story should be a warning lesson to anyone about what can happen. Because sometimes you think, oh, what's the worst that can happen? Well, like, I think my story is maybe not the worst, but it's really bad. What can happen? You can lose complete control of that picture. They can Photoshop my image, they can add different names. So even if sometimes it says that I've taken some tablet for my acne, they Photoshop acne onto my skin. They changed the name and said I was a teacher in the US and I was a hiking guide, some Bonnie sang in Cambodia leading treks. And legally, they were allowed to do that because it says there in the model release form that they can adjust the photo, they can change the name. So they can do anything with that photo, basically, which is horrible if you think about it. So anyone should be cautious of any photographer. I mean, at any point where you're signing something, and I always say this because a lot of people have told me, oh, I've seen my photo in this and I've seen my photo in that, and what can I do? And I'm like, if you didn't sign anything, then you're okay. You can take that up. You can take that up legally even. It's just because I gave it away legally that I couldn't do anything about it. But I mean, people need to be careful, especially I think younger, impressionable. Because I mean, I was one of them. I was in university at the time when I did it. Just to be careful because you can lose control. And I mean, I'm sure he's made money off it. There were 100 people that day. And if I didn't know, if someone in Canada didn't see it, I wouldn't have even known. I didn't make a cent out of it. It's a crazy story. And I think people should use it as a warning as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, it almost sounds like the potential for identity theft, and it's a worrying thing, absolutely. So I'm glad we could just get a bit of that. So now let's get into the latest, which is The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil. I absolutely love this book, and I appreciate that it took a long time to get here. Why? Because for me, this was reading like, when you look at an oil painting, it's not just the superficial once off, the first image that comes to mind. I think that when I read The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil, I could feel the layers. And there's definitely appreciation for process when you can read the layers in your characters and the layers in the plot and in the story as well. Um, Talk to us about the characters in The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil and your inspiration for bringing them together in the way that you have across these multiple dual timelines.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. People always ask me, where did you get the idea for this book? Even because it took so long to write. Shafinaz, it was like you've heard parts of this story because we've done panels with your book, Darlings of Durban, as well. We've done a few. We've been seeing each other quite a bit in the last few weeks, so you know the story a little bit. But because it took such a long time to write, um, I think it became like I see it as like the novel started becoming a journal of all the ideas and things, like a scrap journal of all the ideas and things that I was interested in, I liked over the years, and I kept like inserting them into this novel and trying to tell a story, but I didn't realize it. I was just like shoving all my ideas like into this book. And eventually I started like putting it together as a story. But even all the characters, they're just so strange. And I can't say like, I mean, I could say with Onion Tears that maybe like there were bits and pieces of people that I pulled and made my own characters. But with this novel, it's really hard to say. I can't say where I pulled. I mean, there must have been like novels and books and films where I've taken bits and pieces for sure. Every artist I think takes from things that they're inspired by and they see around them. But I can't even say like, I don't know. Pinky is a character who speaks in third person, but I don't know a person. I don't know anyone who speaks in third person about themselves. Um, so there's an array of characters, and I think I was just trying to explore um, love in all its different ways, and you can only do that by having such a different array of characters who are so different from each another, so they play off each another, and that you get to explore love in all its different forms because each character has a different experience with love. There's a woman who loved her husband but she lost her husband. There was one who was really bitter and probably divorced, but she says he passed away. There's an old man who talks about his wife in a very loving way. There's another woman who stays upstairs who's really bitter and angry about what happened to her. And then there's a great, like, epic love story. I could only explore love by having such a different array of characters who had different love stories to tell.
And I think in many ways, if people were to read this from different age groups, they would glean something different or something relatable or perhaps something not from each of these experiences. Because I think we're all colliding with different relationships or hearing about different relationships. And so I found all of these characters melded together so well. Um, so there was a very interesting aspect that stood out for me as well, which was as much as the jinn is not a main character, I really enjoyed that it was an almost tangible character because we always hear of jinns being told as like the unseen. We don't talk about it. It's something scary. This was not scary. It was a very sort of soft. It was like a bag of emotions walking around the house, moving around the house. I found it very interesting how the jinn was able to take on emotions between the past and the present and sort of thread that together. The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil, which I thought was a fantastic title, obviously, and The Jinn Waits 100 Years. If I were told there were two different titles, I would want to read both those books with a different expectation. Talk to us about the character of the jinn and these titles and how they come together as a wrapping for this particular story.
I think the jinn was supposed to be, and I think it's still in its own way, a small character. And but it was, in terms of like a plot device, it bridged the past and the present really well. To have like the only thing that could have bridged the past and the present, the only character who could have bridged a whole century, is a magical sort of unknown character, right? Because it's such a wide space of time. I mean, although there is one character, I won't give anything away, but there is one character who kind of spans both timelines, but not in the way that the jinn can capture it and present it as a narrator to everybody, because it can present both sides of the story. So the diaries also give us a glimpse into the past, but the jinn also gives us a glimpse into the past. And so the titles are different, um, because I think in the US particularly, they wanted to focus on the jinn. So they wanted to use that in the title. And they didn't think the original title was Paper Flowers, and they didn't think that Paper Flowers was a strong enough, catchy enough title to catch people. So they said we needed to change it, and we gave a few suggestions, which included The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil. But they were very taken by The Jinn Waits 100 Years, which I think was my editor's suggestion. So they chose that. But then when we came to South Africa was like, well, we're not going to use the word jinn because it might. South Africans are very superstitious, and if we have any strong kind of like magical, supernatural word in the title that people might be afraid of, it might actually send readers away from the novel. So, and I had liked The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil, so we stuck with The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil. I think both capture different. There's a lot of spirits you can capture from the book. Spirits, as in the spirit or feeling of the book, not the spirits.
Right.
But and I see the same way with the covers. There's so many different. There's like 3 different covers now, or 4 different covers even, and they capture different things of the novel. So I think there's so much of parts of the novel that you can capture for the market that you want to kind of capture, which I think they've done with the title and with the cover. So if you look at the US cover, it's really, oh, I've actually got it here. It's really much more, it captures like the kind of horror and the fear which is part of that jinn title, and it's more like a mystery. But the South African one, The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil, is much more brighter. It captures the tropicalness of Durban, I think, and that feeling, and it evokes that lushness of the city. So I think, the titles and the covers try to capture different things in different parts of the novel, and I think they're both successful in the way they do it. But it was it's just a marketing thing, really.
Well, it's interesting to see. I mean, I would obviously, like I said, want to read both titles without knowing they meant to depict the same book. But this one is like this love story, this family saga. And I agree with you in terms of the cover. It's almost like you're peeking behind these fronds and rediscovering this grand house that's perhaps not as grand as it used to be. And there's something in that. As people, as we grow through life, we have our grand moments, and then as you age, you start to feel how life happens around you. So I think that was beautifully depicted, and this is precisely it. Like, if we talk about now your strong female characters, you spoke about sort of, you've got your Pinky and your Fancy, but what about Mina and Sana? Let's talk about them on different timelines, but there's this kind of thread that holds them together in the story without giving away too much.
Yeah, um I think they're the 2 strong characters that kind of run the novel, because there is a lot of characters and there's a lot of female characters. But I think Sana is the heart of the novel, and she leads us to Mina, who is was alive in the 1930s. And Sana is always looking for a place to fit in the world. She doesn't feel like she fits in anywhere. She's a misfit. And so I think in these diaries that she finds from the 1930s, she finds a mother figure, or at least someone else who also doesn't fit in like her. And I think eventually she becomes like a mother figure, and she's looking for someone to replace that motherliness that's missing in her life. She's described in the first few pages as an unmothered child. The way she walks and the way she dresses, and she's got kind of like a rough gait to her. And so I think uh, it's like 2 characters reaching out to one another in the novel constantly, but they never meet. I mean, they kind of meet in the end, actually. There is a way that they kind of meet right at the end, but I mean, technically, they don't ever meet. And I think it's just always that longing that runs throughout the novel between these two characters that kind of run the novel.
I think when you talk of the spirit of a story and the spirit of a novel, I think that came to mind for me, that their connection over time, even though they don't physically meet, really runs as a thread in that way. And like you said, strong characters from both timelines. And then you've got these sort of side characters like Jahanara Begum and the Grand Ami. I mean, I love how you managed to capture these different timelines with gravitas, because each of them, I mean, whether it's the contemporary space that Sana is in, or the space that Mina kind of, you know, inhabits for a while, shall we say, you've got the essence of these very different timelines. What was it like writing for 100 years ago?
I think people are not very different. People, I don't feel like I went into a different time. Like I wasn't thinking, oh, this is. I mean, maybe I was thinking in the sense that it's the 1930s, and yes, there's more traditional roles expected, whereas now maybe it's a bit more different. But then again, also not much has changed. Like a woman's role and a man's role, and these kind of duties that are expected of them. Like I think even when Mina moves into the house, there's this it's her mother-in-law who's not being nice to her, which I think people will still say is a problem nowadays. But I mean, there's all the chance of like two different families or two different people coming together in a house when people get married, and those are still issues I think faced today. So I think I didn't think too differently, but I did think maybe take yourself into more what traditions would be in the past, like the role of the mother coming to live in with the son, and if you have two wives, what did it mean in back in the 1930s, and maybe just the language. Like I had to think that, okay, in those days they would be speaking more Urdu, whereas we're now in 2014, the English is a little different. So it's interesting, even when the narrators for the novel, for the audio book, were asking me questions, and I would say, like, for the characters in the past, in the 1930s, give them a more Indian accent because they came from India. But the characters that are now in the present, and I was like, listen to my voice when I'm talking. I would send voice notes. I would be like, it's more like my voice now. So take into account what my voice sounds like. It's not that Indian accent. It's more like neutral. I don't even know how to explain what a Durban what a Durban accent is. But yeah, I mean that I think also is an interesting way of answering that question. When we were doing the audiobook, how do they even speak? What are the accents like? What kind of language were they using? And so I think I thought about those things more when I was looking back at those characters.
And I think the thing that stands out from a reader's point of view is the capturing the, what that time looks like through the eyes of the reader. But exactly what you've pointed out is the language, the tone, the choice of words. It's Jahanara who is trying to sound very Englishy, but the
Mm.
others just fall into step in their characters. And then in the contemporary space, you've got a very Durban sense of the dialects and the choice of words, especially with your Fancy and your Pinky and
Yeah.
those characters. So I think that
Yeah.
definitely comes through very well. I would love to listen to the audiobook to see how they capture all of that.
Yeah, I mean, and also interestingly, just to say, um, my grandfather used to tell us stories about how when he came from India to South Africa in the 1930s. So it's not to say that I know the era really, really well, but I feel like I have a footing in it because he would describe the journey. And part of some of my university projects was I had to interview him about how technology had advanced from when he was a young boy, and then I had to look at my father when he was a young boy, and then look at my own generation. So I did have a lot of like that information in terms of how life was then, back then when he came. He would tell me about how the fridges, they didn't have fridges, they would use ice blocks and keep hay. And when he came to South Africa, he'd never seen electric lights before because he came from a small village. And so he would see street lights here, and he was so shocked to see water running from the taps. He would put his mouth to the tap in like shock. So I had also that kind of information for the day to day small details of life, of how it would be then in the 1930s.
Okay, I think that's amazing that you can, be able to draw from conversations and all of it. And this is the wonderful thing about being a writer in process, is that all of this you're intercepting and processing all the time. So it definitely shows in the final work. What can we look out for in the future from your pen?
Oh, people are asking me this, but I can't really say because I'm still figuring it out. But I think it's going to be nonfiction because I like to keep people
Well,
on their
whatever it
toes.
is, we look forward to it because I'm sure there's parallel projects waiting on their computer and works in progress. So we'll look forward to what's coming next. But in the meanwhile, I know that you're going to have a very exciting time over the rest of this year with the continuing launches of this book. We look forward to seeing what happens out in the future. And I hope that more young people and old are picking up copies of The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil and really experiencing this multi-dimensional, multi-generational story that captures Durban in such beautiful hues. Like I said, it felt like watching an oil painting in the making. So, congratulations on a fantastic book, and I wish you everything of the best in the future.
No, thank you so much for having me, Shafinaz. It was a real pleasure.
And with that, wonderful having Shubnum Khan on the show with The Lost Love of Akbar Manzil and some conversation around her writer's process. Please do get yourself a copy at any local bookstores. If you're watching this from anywhere else in the world, it's been published globally as The Jinn Waits 100 Years. Do go out and get yourself a copy, especially if you're an expat who's really looking forward to a proper Durban story. And that's it from us this weekend on Book Bites. We'll see you next week, inshallah, on Salam Media. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.